Some might call that dangerous, and some might say, what kind of senseless logic? So again, I think that's ridiculous. I don't really know what to say about this other than welcome back to Off the Record. At what point does a government accept that it is so unpopular that it should call a general election? Now, I'm going to share with you my screen as I've done before, and I'm going to scroll through some bookmarks and talk to you about them, give you my views on them, because I get a lot of questions about this. It's far easier to do a video here on Off the Record, so please do subscribe. This is Black Belt Barrister Off the Record for what I really think about these things, because there's a lot to get through here. And please do also forgive my voice. I am bunged up with a cold, so I'll try to get through nice and clearly. So let's look at this first graphic, shall we, from Alex Armstrong of GB News, referring to the YouGov poll of government approval rating. The disapproval rate, that's the people that have actively said they know what's going on and they disapprove of what the government is doing. The approval rate, on the other hand, saying they know what's going on and they approve of what the government's doing, aside from anybody that hasn't been involved with it or just doesn't know. Now, the disapproval rate of 66% versus the approval rate, the ever declining approval rate of people who approve of what this government is doing, is now down to just 12%. So just 12% as a representative of this population approve of what this government is doing. Now, Alex refers to this Labour government as absolutely disastrous, and I would add that this approval rating is absolutely disastrous for any government. He said it's difficult to see how any sane-minded individual can justify that this is what they voted for. There's been a catalogue of different things with which I profoundly disagree. And I get all sorts of comments, such as, going off a cliff, going off on a tangent, because I air the views on these things. But to those people, what I would say is the following. I get an equal number, more in fact, of emails and comments from very senior and respected officers, for example, retired police inspectors from across the country. This plural this is, so a number of different individuals whom I won't name. Other barristers, solicitors, consultants worldwide, a great number of councillors, ministers working for either local authorities or other companies and associations, all coming to me saying the same thing, that I am saying what a lot of people are thinking and want to say and are afraid to say. Now, even I know that there are limits with what I can say, because in the UK we are not a free-speaking nation anymore, because we've dipped in the global assessment of free speech. We no longer have complete free speech in the UK anymore. It is less restricted than other parts of the world. It is not a free speech state anymore. Let's go back to my bookmarks and see what else I've got to comment on here. Rachel Reeves, she says, today I've placed financial services at the heart of the government's growth mission. Britain cannot succeed and meet its growth ambitions without financial services sector that is fighting fit and thriving. All that fluff means she's easing the regulations and the restrictions so that more people can borrow more money as against how much they earn. More multiples of what they earn, they can now borrow. Some might call that unaffordable debt, and some might call that dangerous, and some might say that this could be the recipe for disaster all over again, like the 2008 crash and every crash beforehand, and the knock-on effect that it had with properties. And bear in mind, many of these rules were brought in and put in place to prevent a reoccurrence of the crash that we saw in 2008. So by taking these away to encourage riskier investments, riskier borrowing in order to create growth, again, may well just be a recipe for disaster. Now, I've seen this firsthand. I saw firsthand a lot of places around the country where people were either assisted in buying the property, gifted a deposit, or deferred rates and all of these kind of things. And then within a couple of years, they turned into a ghost town because they just simply couldn't afford the house. And so they obviously got repossessed. And the same happened in a lot of other houses around that area. And then once you get 3 or 4, it becomes a little bit destitute. So people either move out. And then once you get 1 or 2 or 3 like that, then some people move out and then a few more get repossessed and the area turns into a ghost town. And all that does is crash the house price in that area. and that has a knock-on effect on the areas beside it. This is simple maths and simple economics. And speaking of simple economics, or so you'd have thought, David Atherton, among many, have posted about David Lammy's latest brainwave to hand over £70 million to Singapore for a clean energy transition, bearing in mind that Singapore government has no debt and has billions of pounds of surplus, whereas Britain is heading towards a £3 trillion deficit, and Singaporeans per capita earn 2.5 times that of individuals in the United Kingdom. What kind of senseless logic is David Lammy working on to send £70 million to Singapore? Now, I have nothing against Singapore, but they don't need our money for any kind of clean energy transition. If anyone is best placed to be doing a clean energy transition, it would be somewhere like Singapore, not the UK, where we are struggling, it seems, in every area of the economy to grow and to thrive, being taxed to the hilt. Jobs are going down, vacancies are going down, and yet the taxes are set, by all accounts, to rise significantly in the autumn. I can only predict, but hope that I'm wrong, that they are going to slap yet further taxes on companies, which is in turn going to have a knock-on effect on individuals, because a tax on the employer is always a tax on the productivity of the employee. Remember that, because it's the employee that generate ultimately the working revenue for that company. And so a tax on the company, but in reverse, is going to be a tax on that individual. You can ask any seasoned, proper economist, and it is going to be a tax on the individual. Increasing the employer national insurance is going to have an effect upon that individual worker every single time. But another story that has everybody talking is this rather secretive transfer of almost 20,000 Afghans relocating to the UK after a personal data leak, which I'll come back to in a minute, because there's something really odd about that. Now, bearing in mind what I've said on my main channel today about one Afghan individual. Now, this is not to say anybody within this 20,000 cohort will go the same way, but this one individual was charged and sentenced for rape of a young girl. And he was sentenced to 9 years in prison with a 3-year additional license requirement. But the point for him that I made in my main video was that he still doesn't believe that he did anything wrong. Now, that aside, there have been reports now of the lifting of a super injunction, which is essentially an injunction not just to prohibit dissemination of any information, but also to prohibit people that know of the injunction from telling anyone else that the injunction exists. So I've scanned through these documents, so it's very difficult to summarize these adequately. But in short, there are 7 judgments in total with a press release, and the press release does summarize some of what happened here. Essentially, there was a data set of people in Afghanistan who had reportedly assisted the MOD and whose data was then reportedly somehow, some of it, published on a Facebook page in August 2023. These were people involved in 2 schemes run by the MOD. One was the Afghan Relocations and Assistance Policy, ARAP, and an ex gratia scheme later called the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, ARCS. These enabled people who'd worked with the UK in Afghanistan prior to 2021 to apply to the MOD for relocation to the UK. Now, that in itself you might not have a problem with, because if those in Afghanistan had worked with the UK, assisted the UK in our efforts and so on, but as a direct result of that, or even indirect result of that, them and their families were at risk of torture or being killed and so on, then obviously there is a need then to protect those people. What I think a lot of people are probably going to be upset about, and it's not even to say that it is wrong, but what a lot of people will be upset about is that all this was sort of secretive, to the extent that there was a super injunction that the judge, and I understand the reasoning because I've read the judgments, but the judge went further in the injunction than was asked. So everything was to remain completely private and, as some would call it, secretive. What I come back to, I think is really odd, is that at point 5 of the press summary here, it said in August 23, it became known to MOD that part of the dataset had been published on a Facebook page. After this, MOD applied for the injunction. Now, data doesn't accidentally get published to a Facebook page. That is really odd. But this dataset contained information about more than 33,000 applicants. Excuse me, a brief interruption for a sneezing fit, which I didn't leave in the video, but this dataset apparently relates to more than 33,000 applicants and was released in error, in part, in 2022. So I find this all a bit odd. So I'm not going to make too much more comment about that, because obviously we're talking about lives here and the prevention of torture and loss of life. So there are detailed reasonings within the judgments. I'm going to read and digest them. You can find them. They are now publicly available. But just know that anybody that knew of that injunction couldn't even tell anybody that the injunction existed, much less divulge anything that the injunction prohibited them from disclosing. But as I say, I think people will be mostly upset that this was all done in secret. But what's not so secretive, thanks to the media and social media and so on, is the schoolgirl who was punished for wearing a dress with the Union Jack on it for Culture Day, because her school had said that they were to celebrate their culture, and so she decided to wear the Union Jack, in part as a sort of reminiscence of the Spice Girls. But ironically, instead of being celebrated, she was told that the dress was unacceptable. She was dragged out of lessons, made to sit in reception. Her father was called to come and collect her because they said that that wasn't acceptable. Courtney Wright, bless her, said that she was so embarrassed and couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. Her father said she shouldn't be made to feel embarrassed about being British, and she shouldn't be punished for celebrating being British. Nobody else I've spoken to can quite get their heads around it. And so I would add my voice to that and say I absolutely cannot understand any sense of logic whatsoever why the school would punish a girl for wearing the Union Jack to celebrate being British and British culture. I can only guess and infer between the lines that somehow, by some twisted logic, they were somehow punishing her for not playing with the narrative of celebrating other cultures outside of the UK. And now, before I get critical comments in the comment section, my wife is Chinese, therefore our son is mixed race, and I've spent a lot of my time over the last 20 years in China, and I would say that a lot of my cultural identity is shared as a family with China, because we've been back and forth to China. Obviously, half my family is now Chinese, and so I share that culture. So when we send him to school, if they have a culture day, we might choose between British and Chinese because he shares both of our culture. And I'm quite sure that nobody watching this would object to either of those, be that British or Chinese or a mix of both, because he shares both cultures and he treasures both cultures. And so for a British child to go in a Union flag dress to celebrate British culture would have my absolute full support. And I think the school is probably quite rightly embarrassed by this now, probably because of the national media attention, but hopefully to see some kind of sense of logic and pull them back on track a little bit, and actually pull some common sense and not repeat silly things like this again. And I would hope that other schools and other organizations would see things like this and see that this is the kind of attention and publicity you get when you do something that the vast public will disagree with. I think people of all cultures would probably disagree with the decision to punish a child for wearing something of their culture just because it happens to be British. Bit of a rant, I know, but as someone in a family with mixed background and heritage, I think it is vitally important to keep those traditions alive. And so I do hope that they learn something from this. And finally, another ridiculous story I'm going to comment on here is another school, Newhouse Academy in Greater Manchester, has announced that it's going to ban skirts for its schoolgirls. Now, I don't really know what to say about this other than I think it's utterly ridiculous. And I don't know what the real reasoning is behind it. It suggests in the article that it is to go for a gender-neutral uniform. I don't know whether it's to do with gender or whether it's anything to do with dress generally, or whether there's any sort of modesty aspect involved. which some have suggested that it has something to do with religion, but I'm not sure what the real reasoning is. Nonetheless, they banned skirts and parents pushed back. They had a consultation, but the school is going ahead with the trousers-only policy despite objections. One parent has told Manchester Evening News that they should challenge the ruling on the basis that it disregards female students and their right to express their femininity and is not expressing two genders equally and so on. Now, I would probably agree with that, because any decision by an organisation as a blanket policy that has the effect of directly or indirectly discriminating against one sex or another, sex being the protected characteristic here, would have a potential ground to complain for discrimination on the basis that trousers are generally for boys. And now, whilst they probably say that girls can wear them if they wish, I think that should be a choice. Whereas the standard school uniform, which girls would expect to wear, and I think the vast majority would expect to wear, would be a skirt. Now, I find it, again, this is probably the third or fourth time I've commented on or felt the need to comment on what children are wearing in school. What kind of system are we coming to where these make headlines? First, it was a company that said that they restrict where they buy the uniform from, which is a separate issue. That wouldn't really be discrimination, because it's you must buy it from this place. But in that case, it was the skirt was so subtly different you couldn't really tell, but they punished her for it because it was a different skirt. This is entirely different. This is another matter entirely. This is one that does bring it within the realms of potential discrimination, because all girls now required to wear trousers is detracting from what they might expect being female. So again, I think that's ridiculous, and I think that should be reversed. If they've got any sense of logic, that should be reversed. It should go back to how it was. They should have the choice to wear trousers if they wish, and so that cuts through any neutrality argument. If one girl doesn't like the idea of wearing a skirt, she can wear trousers depending on how she personally feels about it. That would be a matter for them. But generally, I think it's ridiculous to make all children and all girls wear trousers. Let me know what you think in the comments to that. But those are my real views, and that's what you're here for on Black Belt Barrister Off the Record. And so before I lose my voice entirely, please do subscribe. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you next time.